So guys, I'm just thrilled to have back on the line Jeff Nielson. Always a pleasure to talk with Jeff, especially in a time of madness where 90% of the world is still asleep. Jeff, how are you?
Fine, Sean. It's a pleasure to be back again.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you back. There's a million things we could talk about. Things are changing so quickly, it's really getting hard to keep up. I've got a list of things I'm happy to talk about, but I want to see what was on your mind. What do you got?
Well, one of my more recent commentaries was basically suggesting that the latest ambush in the precious metal sector was not a typical banker operation, but is rather a new approach, something we haven't seen before. The equivalent of essentially having a suicide bomber acting in the sector.
Yeah, the article is called Suicide Bombers in the Gold Market, and you wrote that on February 7th. And, I think what's interesting about that date that you released that article on, Jeff, is that on that same date, J.P. Morgan announced that it will accept physical gold as collateral, but ironically it will not accept shares of the GLD ETF as collateral. So the question is, Jeff, did the bankers know something they aren't telling the public?
Well, that's been my position all along, that these bullion ETF funds are really not what they are represented to be. Specifically, to me, they've always looked like essentially a vehicle for the bankers to actually use for their shorting operations in the gold and silver markets.
Yeah, and to get back to your Suicide Bombers in the Gold Market article, evidence appears that that's exactly what happened again with this Daniel Shack and his $10 million that he used to leverage his way to $850 million in a spread trade.
I can't actually claim to have immediately picked up on this myself. What actually happened is I was listening to an interview with Ben Davies of Hind Capital, and he was talking about this trade in more detail, and then musing aloud, why had the CFTC ever allowed such an extremely flawed and vulnerable trade to have been created in the first place, since they're supposedly supposed to step in and prevent these sorts of dangerous positions from being created in the first place. And then, of course, suddenly it seemed to click that, rather than this being simply an opportunity which the bankers had capitalized on, that rather instead they had likely created this entire situation right from the beginning.
It's crazy that they would allow basically a previously unknown metals trader to essentially leverage his position 85-1 in the U.S. gold futures market, which was equal to the size of more than 10% of the entire market. Now, you wrote that the logic here is elementary. When you have a committed hyperinflationist like Ben Bernanke ready to create another $600 billion out of thin air, merely with a mouse click, this quote-unquote bad trade or this 85-1 leverage was probably encouraged, or at least the CFTC was happy to look the other way, huh?
Well, this is the whole thing. As we all know, what the bankers are running out of is actual physical bullion to back their positions. Conversely, they can get a hold of more, Bernanke bills anytime they want to in infinite quantities. So if they can simply start to detonate these suicide bombs in the gold and silver markets using nothing but, more banker paper, and then, create the same sort of ambush effect that we've seen in the past when they normally have had to dump bullion in order to create this situation. This obviously is a tactic which we're very likely to see repeated.
Essentially, what we're describing here, and I love the way you framed this up in your article in Suicide Bombers, these people are essentially economic terrorists. What the Bernanke is doing is he's using the dollar as the ultimate tool of economic terrorism, and these bankers are out of control.
When we saw the quote-unquote euro debt crisis suddenly materialize out of nowhere, this is basically what I accused the U.S. Financial community and the U.S. government of being involved in back then was economic terrorism. Essentially, what they've been doing is using the derivatives known as credit default swaps to, first of all, create extreme vulnerability in the debt markets of these European nations, and then they literally launch attacks in the credit default swap markets by shorting the credit default swaps very heavily, which then drives up the cost of that insurance, and that in turn drives up interest rates. And of course, the ridiculous part about these credit default swaps is, even though this is a form of insurance, parties which are not even a part of the original debt transaction are allowed to make bets on these debt instruments. And of course, that's totally insane. And, it's an ideal tool for this sort of economic terrorism. And then now what we could be seeing is it's simply being extended into the gold and silver markets as well.
Jeff, in January when silver was under some pressure, I had issued a video in which I alerted folks to just remain cautious of the fact that the bankers are merely shaking the tree. They were trying very hard to remove decent people from their physical and remove physical from weak hands. And as you write, that's not going to work. The bottom line will always remain that once the last of the banksters' real bullion has been given away, these are your words, by themselves at rock bottom prices, then their manipulation games are finally over. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this snapback that we've seen, now silver is pushing $31 and gold is bouncing back, isn't that exactly what we're seeing? We're seeing a market driven by physical demand in which paper games aren't working the way they used to. And in fact, they're barely working at all.
Well, and along with that, there's the new rumor circulating in the gold market that China has decided upon a new tactic for accumulating gold bullion for itself, specifically to buy up units of GLD and then to request delivery through the vehicle that fund provides to do redemptions. And, of course, if that is taking place, that's the bankster's worst nightmare, especially if you believe what I suggested before, that they use these funds as their primary vehicles to fund their shorting operations. So if, China is planning to essentially drain the swamp, quote-unquote, by cleaning out what GLD is holding, that could greatly expedite this whole process towards, eliminating the last of the bankster's bullion.